Hey guys, it's the Pink King here, and wait, hold on, let me slide into something a bit more fitting. Ah, there we go. To celebrate Fright Month, I am currently doing a drawing every day up to Halloween. If you want to see them, as well as updates on my projects such as puzzle pieces, which a big announcement was just posted on my Instagram, then head over to my Instagram and get a real taste of the season. So, to start off October, let's talk about a horror movie. No, not those ones today, but rather one you've probably forgotten about. So, this is where I ask you, do you remember Split? Yeah, Split. Released in 2016, Split was a horror movie about a guy called Kevin Wemble Crumb, a man with 23 personalities who kidnaps 3 girls because they are impure to him, and they have to try and escape him before his 24th personality emerges, called the Beast. It may be hard to believe now, but Split was a movie damn near everyone was talking about. No matter where you went, you couldn't escape it. People were leaving the theatre with so many questions, theories, and confusion that it became a surprise hit, which is kind of fitting seeing how this was the year of sudden things blowing up. You know, things like Vine and the killer clown trend. But despite how big this movie was at the time, it seems like nobody remembers it. And I'm here to talk about that and see if you remember it or not. Now, what made Split such a talked about subject? Well, I would argue it's a couple of reasons. First was the guy who made it, M. Night Shyamalan. A very hit or miss director, you might say. Yeah, this guy was at one point considered the best director working in the business, but by his own ambitions tended to get in his own way. With him making movies like The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, but also making things like The Happening, Signs, and even Avatar: The Last Airbender movie. Yeah, to say the least, he's one of the most infamous directors, for better or for worse. So when it was announced that he'd be making not only a horror movie, but one that would delve into the mind of a person with DID, it definitely got people talking. Hell, the first trailer garnered a humongous 30 million views alone on YouTube. That's almost as much as Halloween's 2018 first trailer, and Halloween's already a part of a giant franchise that was on its comeback. So for what seemed to be a new standalone horror movie, don't worry, we'll get back to that, to garner this much attention was ever rarely seen.
Don't worry. I'll talk to him.
But where did this attention come from? Well, that attention probably came from reason 2, the controversy. Yeah, this movie was not subtle for what it was about in any way. It took a lot of risks that nowadays you probably wouldn't be able to get away with, such as the villain Kevin, played by James McAvoy, is a man with DID, or dissociative identity disorder. A very real condition many people have that can be a very touchy subject. So you could probably imagine why there was some backlash that the psycho villain was the one to have it. Now, let me just clarify, I am not an expert by any means on the subject, but for me personally, I feel it was handled fairly well. It never blames the disorder itself as for the evil actions he does, but rather uses it as a tool for grief. As it's shown that the only reason these evil personalities exist is because of the trauma and pain they have suffered. And I really appreciate the fact they go out of their way to show that not every personality is like that. Hell, there's only 4 evil ones out of the entire 24 of them. So yeah, you can definitely make an argument that it probably wasn't done the best to represent people with DID, but then again you can also make the argument that it wasn't really trying to. After all, horror and being afraid all comes from emotion, and the feeling of it being real. Personally, if it's going to be a horror film, then it should have some leeway, because that's the entire point of horror, to scare people. So you kinda have to take risks in order to make it work. But it wasn't only the use of DID that was controversial. In fact, you could argue most of what happens in this movie is shocking. There's obviously the kidnapping storyline, but also the themes of abuse, trauma, the unwell not getting the help and respect they need, and even some nasty stuff. Yeah, if you've seen the movie, you probably know what I'm talking about. Point being that this movie has a ton of taboo subjects in it, than most horror movies at the time did. And unlike most horror movies, at the time, Split relied more on its themes for shock value instead of any gore. Hell, you only have any form of light blood in the last 10 minutes. So for a movie to use more psychological terror instead of just visual terror was a rare sight to see at the time. Not saying that it hasn't been done since then, but most psychological terror still included a lot of violence and gore. This was one that excluded the gore, and focused mainly on the psychology of it. And for me personally, I felt it was effective. The carefully chosen music and the camera work really makes this movie scary and uncomfortable when it wants you to be. Although it can be a little too over the top at times, when this film is good, it's really quite good. But there's still one more reason as to why this movie was so talked about. And you probably know it, it has to be the ending.
What was it?
Mr. Glass.
M. Night is known for his plot twists, but nobody saw this one coming. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, the ending reveals that this movie is in fact not a standalone movie, and that it's actually a sequel to Unbreakable, another one of Shyamalan's movies, released 16 years prior. And yes, nobody saw that coming. It was such a out of nowhere idea and addition that everyone couldn't help but talk about it. Because not only did it say that these two shared the same world, but it also established that there would be a crossover someday. And I know that crossovers are more commonplace now, but in 2016, this was rather astonishing because the only form of major crossovers in movies were either films that only had standalone films, or the MCU. There was no real in-between. So for this one to come out and have it make sense, yeah, it definitely grabbed people's attention. The thought of how they would combine two very different movies to make a sequel, the daunting thought got people chatting because it was fascinating to talk about, before they ruined it. Now comes the tough question I'll try to answer, and that's, why did Split fall to the wayside? Well, there's a few possibilities. Number one, it was the sequel, Glass. Glass was very anticipated, with everyone wanting to know just how they would bring all the characters together, and the results were less than satisfying. I'm not going to act like the other two were Shakespeare, but they had a clear vision for what they wanted to be, and they ran with it. Glass had no idea what it wanted to be. Was it a Unbreakable sequel, or was it a Split sequel? Was it a movie about Glass, or was it a movie about people with the gifts? The movie tried to be all of them, and thus ended up being none of them. And so with a very disappointing movie, the results were just as disappointing, with the franchise dying there and then. And worst of all, leaving people to forget they ever existed. Or just throw all of them in the same category because the last one was bad. Reason 2? Was the fact it came out at possibly the worst time. Glass was released on January 2019. January being known for one of the worst times in movie season. After all, it's just coming off Christmas, it's not quite the summer yet, so less people are going to want to see it. Also, with the giant hype being built up around movies like The Lion King remake, Toy Story 4 and Endgame, Glass got left to the dust of the bigger movies and was forgotten about before it even released. So the franchise went out on a whimper, and alongside its quality, it essentially killed its own franchise by being nothing special. After all, it's often how you finish things is what people will remember you the most for. And it's at this point I ask you, yes, you the viewer, do you remember Split? Me personally, I probably won't think about it constantly, but when I do, I remember everything about this movie. And to me, I feel this movie should be remembered. It took giant risks at the time and managed to make them work for the most part. It managed to show just enough and leave you questioning enough. And when a movie leaves you with wanting to know more, then it's doing a good job. And it was overall just really interesting. Way more interesting than it had any right to be. But, what about you? Do you remember Split? And if so, what do you think about it? Were you as fascinated as I was, or were you left underwhelmed? Do you love these movies, or do you forget they ever existed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I've been the Pink King, and I will see you all next time.